Tasman's not that difficult to wrap your brain around if you are familiar with UT fundamentals. 2.2 turbo diesel up the pointy end, which has slightly below average outputs, would be the kindest way I could put that. It drives an 8-speed transmission, and the integration there is flat out brilliant because that transmission understands exactly what gear to be in every driving scenario that I've subjected that vehicle to for 2 weeks now. So that's pretty impressive. There's a 2-speed transfer case off the back of the transmission, which gives you high range for normal sort of driving and low range for demanding off-road, where you need torque multiplication or really low travel speed. The clever thing about the transfer case, apart from that, is that it's also got all-wheel drive mode built in. And in this respect, that's kind of like the V6 Ranger and the Triton, because they will both pull those party tricks out as well. In other utes, you can't drive around in 4-wheel drive on a high traction surface, and in slippery conditions like wet bitumen or dirt roads with lots of traction, it's a bad idea to engage 4-wheel drive in those vehicles, but not Tasman, certainly not Triton and not V6 Ranger. They are designed for that. In this vehicle, a computer just decides how much drive to send to the rear and how much drive to send to the front in various driving scenarios. The computer's also pretty good off-road. There's extremely strong, well thought out traction control intervention for off-road driving in the way that there simply isn't in most other vehicles in this class. So that's a real plus as well. I don't know what else to tell you about the Tasman, except the payload capacity is kind of interesting, because if you want a novated lease, you can't get a novated lease on a vehicle with a payload capacity greater than 1,000 kilos. In that case, Kia is quite happy to sell you one of these babies with a payload capacity just under 1,000. And if that's not you and you want the maximum payload capacity, they're quite happy to sell you a Tasman with a payload capacity just over 1,000. And they're exactly the same vehicle. It's just a paperwork exercise, okay? So I guess that's interesting or perverse, whatever. Anyway, that's how it is. Now, I need to tell you just quickly that this video and videos like this are only possible because of my enduring retirement preventing side hustles, which would be getting new vehicles cheap, just like Tasman, mainstream vehicles. That's what we do, unless you especially enjoy being gutted financially on the showroom floor every 3 to 5 years. You can still do that by all means. Alternatively, you could fill in the contact form on my website at autoexpert.com.au. I'll put links in the description and we will help you out with that. We don't even charge you a fee. We charge the dealer a fee for finding them the sale if you go ahead with the purchase. The other side hustle, of course, is home solar, which is a much better deal for the environment and your back pocket than buying an electric car. So if you want a quality home solar system with locally sourced components, not made in Australia, but with Australian inventory and onshore support, which is so important if there's a technical glitch down the track. The dudes I use have consulting engineers in-house. They consult on every installation and they only use non-cowboy installers, and they only source components that are reliable, high-quality components that are warehoused in Australia with local support. So you can look at the link in the description for that as well. And the one other thing I've got to tell you about the Tasman, which is a point of difference but should not be in the 21st century, is disc brakes up the pointy end, but hidden in plain sight. You've been looking at them the whole time. Disc brakes down the rear as well. Take that, Hilux, Navara, Triton, D-Max, She-Max, et frickin' cetera, still mired in drum brakes down the back. But as you can see, it simply doesn't have to be this way. Okay, so I've just had something of a quick scratch around, and already I'd have to say that there's a lot to talk about. This ute is significantly better in terms of the granular detail of its construction than anything I've yet seen in the ute domain from China, in particular compared with the JACT9 ute, which was especially rough around the edges. The Tasman is particularly polished in the engineering domain. The welding in particular is really nice. Like, all of the structural welding is done especially well. It looks like robotic spray transfer MIG to me, because there's hardly any spatter. It's more consistent than a human being could ever be. And when you look at the granular detail of where the weld runs are on symmetrical parts left and right on the car, they start and stop seemingly in exactly the same positions. And you would never be able to do that if you were a human. So there's that. The chassis is also much more completely welded than, in particular, the JACT9 I had a look at. There's a lot more welds and a lot less open joint in the stitch welded parts, right? So when they put a chassis together, it's two C-section tubes and they overlap. I don't generally completely weld the whole thing, but the ratio of weld to void is much higher here in the Tasman than it is in the T9 in particular. Like, the T9's got a lot more voids in the welds, and the welds are a lot rougher. There wasn't the same completeness of fusion across the majority of the weld bead and things of this nature that really do matter if you care about durability. Now, superficially, there's some decent bash plates. That might be a liberty with the truth. Feels like about 1.2, maybe 1.5 millimetre steel plate. Let's call them scuff plates, because I don't know how much of a bash they protect against, but they probably are pretty good protection against a tsunami of water coming in a deep river crossing kind of scenario. Might help push a bow wave ahead of the vehicle. They're really nicely made. There's a lot of formed surfaces on them to boost the rigidity, and the coverage is pretty complete. There's even a mini bash plate, not unlike this one, over the lowest portion of the transfer case, just behind the rear transmission cross member. So they have thought about scuff protection for moderate off-roading. A notable omission, though, is that when I looked at the bare chassis inside Kia's showroom, because they've got a pre-production car that they cleaned up and they just stripped it back to the powertrain and chassis essentially, and you can look at that in their showroom at Macquarie Park. It's quite interesting. It had these dirty big recovery points at the back. These are not present on this car, and I have subsequently found out that they are an optional extra, even though this is X Pro, okay? So it is the most off-road focused, allegedly, of all the Tasmans in the range. But if you want rear recovery points, you need to buy the rear recovery point option with the tow bar, okay? Which seems like an expensive omission to me. Anyway, also interesting in the scuff plate protection domain is the fuel tank. Let's go and have a look at that. Nothing all that revolutionary about the fuel tank, I'd suggest, except you're not exactly looking at it right now. You're looking at the scuff protection for it, which, like the fuel tank itself, is plastic, which probably means HDPE, like high density polyethylene, the same thing they make milk bottles and detergent bottles and things like that out of, although obviously significantly thicker. I'm going to say the scuff protection is 3.5 millimetres thick, but once again, it is only plastic, so it's not exactly a bash plate, more of just minor sort of scuff protection there. Better than just having a bare fuel tank, I guess, but I don't know how much actual protection is on offer from this plastic scuff panel. So if you're thinking about doing really hardcore off-roading on rocky stuff with breakover angle compromise, where you might have, rocky terrain with sharp stuff that can just come up here at a moment's notice, you can drop a wheel off something and all of a sudden, dish, you get shearing forces and tearing kind of forces there potentially. I'm not saying this is a dodgy design, I'm just saying it's not exactly the definition of hardcore that you might need if you want to do really, really hard stuff off-road. There's a few interesting things right about here. Just above us here is the plastic sump of Hyundai Kia's in-house 8-speed transmission, which when I drill down into that, I understand it is ZF inspired, which might be at least part of the way to explaining why the powertrain integration in this car is so good, meaning the way that the transmission and the engine talk to each other and seemingly are always in the right ratio for most driving conditions. That's very impressive. I'm warming up to these plastic sumps, by the way, because I think they might be at least as durable as the pressed steel ones that preceded them, and possibly the die-cast aluminium ones before that, or in parallel with them at the same time, whatever. What I can't get to the bottom of, however, at least the rationale for it, is right here. There's this felt or plasticized felt fabric feeling wrapping on part of the engine sump. Not on the left-hand side, it's completely plain, but underneath and on the right-hand side and wrapping around to the front next to the differential, which is just here, the sump, for whatever reason, it's an alloy sump. It's wrapped in this plastic felt material, and I have no idea why. I don't know if it's got something to do with the proximity of the fuel lines just here. I can't see how that would be the case. But anyway, it's wrapped in that stuff, and they decided that it was worth spending the money to develop that in R&D. If you've got some idea why that might be necessary, I'd love to hear about that in the comments, because it's a bit of a head scratcher for me. One of the things that I am, however, really, really happy about, and is not a head scratcher at all, is just up here. Obviously, this is the exhaust pipe, front of the car this way, front wheel just here. This is the lower edge of the chassis as it just goes past the front suspension, right? So it's descending back to run towards the back of the car just here. And above this pipe is the DPF, and it is way up here. It is so out of the way, refreshingly out of the way compared with some other quote unquote off-roaders. There is no way that I can see that that DPF is in any way vulnerable to the grass wraparound fire scenario. Okay, it is extremely well protected from that. If you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, when you're off-road driving, often there are two wheel ruts with dead grass on the hump in the middle, right? And as you drive over them, the dead grass has the propensity to wrap around hot exhaust components, and then you've got high temperatures, airflow, flammable material, which is the kind of unholy trinity of a disaster for off-roading. And thankfully, I don't know if it's serendipitous or whether they actually chose to put it way up there, but that DPF is extremely well protected from this kind of risk, and it is sandwiched in there. So they went to considerable effort to package that up. It's really close to the transmission. It's actually got a mount for the DPF, which is a fabricated steel plate that's bent into a bracket, just hard mounted to the side of the transmission. So it is really well stuck up there and very well protected from the fire risk scenario. The passenger compartment has some really good heat shielding just above the length of the exhaust that is under the passenger compartment. And there's a decent old drain here too in the passenger compartment. So I guess if you do manage to get in there with a whole bunch of wet whatever, or you go in a really, really deep river, then at least most of that water is going to drain out. And that's well thought out as well. It's out of the way. It's not going to turn into an entry port for water unless you breach the wading depth, obviously. But it is a pretty good drainage facility there that hopefully will stop a bit of rust happening over time. So might be a bit of a bonus for longevity as well. Just to reorient you here, you're looking from the front of the car to the rear of the car behind me. And what I want to talk about are these two diagonal braces here that go from the bottom of the chassis rail to the transmission rear cross member just here. So there's this diagonal brace here in the horizontal plane and this diagonal brace here. And this sort of screams design afterthought to me. Like, I don't know anything specific about the choice and when it was made to include these two braces, but this is generally what a design afterthought looks like. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but this is a fairly standard rectangular section. It's 60 millimetres wide and 20 millimetres deep, so it's designed to be stiff in the horizontal plane. It's intrinsically floppy sort of in the other two vertical planes, right? And it can only be because it's bolted to a bracket on the bottom of the chassis and it's welded to this rear transmission cross member. So I can only assume that it's here, its only function can be to stop this region here turning into a bit of a parallelogram under God knows what loads. So it's probably there as a noise, vibration, harshness, refinement, countermeasure kind of thing, but I don't think they would design this way off the bat. I think they probably noticed something that they hadn't foreseen in testing, and then they had to figure out how to make this region ever so slightly stiffer, because basically it triangulates the joint between the chassis rail here and the rear transmission cross member. In other words, it's a bit of like a gusset, it's a diagonal brace, and it just stops these connections here on each side between the rear transmission cross member turning into a hinge under the influence of whatever loads. But it is really interesting when you get under a car and have a look, because if there were some sort of design afterthought, sort of above the plimsoll line, if you like, then it would be glossed over or covered up, or it would be finessed differently than just down here, because just down here it's only like service technicians and mechanics who are ever going to look at this stuff, right? Here's the best shot I can drum up for you of the rear springs, okay? Centre of the rear axle there, and this is the leading edge of the rear leaf. My understanding is that when this car emerged from R&D and was first shown to the Australian tuning team, it only had 2 leaves, right? I think it was 2. Anyway, it's now got 4, and I think this is a direct consequence of tuning for Australia. And this leaf spring is quite long also. In total, I'm going to say it looks like maybe 1.4, maybe 1.5 metres long, which is quite long for a leaf spring. It's variable rate, because you can see that the bottom leaf is emphatically not engaged. This ute is unladen at the moment, so it's designed to engage progressively as load in the rear increases, right? So this is one of the reasons why the ride quality is okay in this car unladen. It's also a funny shape, this leaf, because it's like the top of the harbour bridge where it crosses over the axle, but then it is curved the other way just before we get to the spring hangers, front and rear. So it's quite a convoluted compound curve in the top leaf at least. And the bottom leaf is just like the harbour bridge, it's curved down, okay? So that is noteworthy, I guess. The only thing I care about is how does it ride and handle, and the answer is, you know, pretty good. The other thing that's interesting is that the bump stop is mounted to the top of the spring, and I know Kia is lobbying the factory pretty heavily as we speak to change to the inverted kind of more progressive bump stop a la Ford Ranger as a version 2.0 of the Tasman suspension tuning. While we're talking about that, they're also lobbying for an even thicker front anti-roll bar just to stiffen that ride up at the front a little bit. Perhaps not to make it as stiff as Ranger in cornering, but just to come sort of halfway there. I don't mind the way it is currently at the front, although, you know, 5% better, 5% less roll at the front might be the sweet spot. Still feels pretty sweet to me. On dynamics, this vehicle is pretty good unladen, I have to say. And the only reason I say unladen is I haven't had a heavy load in it at this point. So the other thing that's kind of interesting at the rear here is this is emblematic of the construction quality that I see in this vehicle compared with Chinese utes I've had a look at. And that would be that the integrity of the wiring and the other plumbing, etc., that you see, like brake line plumbing and electrical wiring, and because there needs to be a speed sensor for each wheel, and that's for the ABS and the traction control to function. And then there's also, this is X Pro, so it's got an electrically locking rear differential, like driver selectable locking rear diff, and the cabling for that goes in just at the top of the diff, and it's all routed very professionally, I'd have to say. It's really rigid, and there's very little chance of damage from driving through tracks with obstacles and broken off branches and things like that on it. They've done a really good job with all of that hair and makeup style of professionalism with the plumbing and the cables. So I wouldn't be too worried about the integrity of any of that long term. If you're even vaguely interested in production engineering, here's an interesting factoid about the chassis on this car. We're looking at the front this way, okay, and the back this way. So there's a hump in the chassis going over the front suspension just here. There's a hump in the chassis going over the back suspension just here. And then there's this flat bit in the centre. But the chassis is not made of one contiguous length of material. It's actually modular, and it's made in 3 bits. So from the front of the car, humping over the suspension to roughly here, where the rear transmission cross member is, that's one piece of chassis. And then between this edge just here and where the muffler starts, that's another piece of chassis just there. And then when we go up and hump over the differential and go to the arse end of the vehicle, that's a 3rd piece of chassis right there. So it's modular. And these things don't happen by accident. So the only thing I can think of here is that this centre section is designed to be production variable. Like, what I mean is when you design another variant of a Tasman, like a single cab or a space cab variant or something else that we don't know about in the future, you might zip this centre section out here and zip in a different centre section that would give you variable wheelbase or variable other features for mounting God knows what just above. Another interesting thing while we're down here, so to speak, is that in the domain of engineering afterthoughts, I think this might be one as well, because this is roughly in the centre of the cabin space, just here, like pretty much line ball in the middle of the wheelbase. And part of the wiring loom for the body comes out of the arse of a grommet just here and is wrapped by heat shielding tape next to the exhaust pipe, obviously. There's a connector mounted just here, low down on the chassis rail, and then there's more body wiring loom departing to the rear, wrapped in heat insulation and then disappearing elsewhere. So why does it come out here, and why is the connector just sort of cable tied to the side of this flat piece of the chassis? I'm not exactly sure why that is the case. Maybe they've got the front wiring loom built here and the back wiring loom built there, and they've got to join them together somehow, and it's got to come out of the body. But I don't know why you'd choose it here. I don't know why you've got these curves in it here. I don't know why it's not higher up, potentially the better to protect it. So maybe that's something that happened late in the production process as well and had to have a Band-Aid over it, as opposed to a better integrated solution from the get-go. And hey, perhaps we'll never know. A couple of things that I just wanted to cover off because they're important, I guess, if you want a complete picture. One of them's just a technical curiosity, and you'd be able to see it just from here if you had Superman's X-ray vision, just by looking up in that general direction. Because if you look through the radiator, you would see that this car has an air-to-water intercooler. Most cars use air-to-air intercoolers, like glorified radiators for inlet air after the turbocharger, mounted right up the front. This car's not like that. It uses water as the heat exchange medium. And generally car makers do that as a way of solving a packaging problem. Like it's hard to fit the intercooler into a particular confined space, and therefore you go to the extra expense of air to water. There's better thermal efficiency as well, but I'm not seeing that reflected in a big boost in the output numbers for this engine. So what I'd suggest it probably is there for throttle response, because it reduces the length of plumbing that you need on the inlet air by a considerable amount. I've just had a look and I think they've probably saved maybe 600 odd millimetres of plumbing, and that improves the response because there's less mass of air to get out of the way to evolve when operating conditions change, right? So that's a bit of an advantage, and maybe that's one of the reasons why this car seems to drive so well despite having on paper such mediocre output numbers. Like peak output numbers, not that special. Actual drive experience, pretty decent, you know, considering the low numbers. So the other thing I want to talk to you about, and I don't want to upend Kia here because I've done enough of that on the Millhouse and Robbie the Robot copulating front sort of thing, but it's important for you if you're actually in the market for this car, in particular buying one of these X-Line or X-Pro expensive variants, because Kia had to do all of this R&D in one hit and then you have to pay for it, right? When, I don't know, Mitsubishi, for example, or Toyota or someone, they evolve to the next model of Hilux or Triton, whatever it is, they really only change 20 or 25% of the fundamentals of the vehicle, and that gets added to the amortization bill, whereas 100% of the problem has to be amortized in this case because this is a brand new vehicle. And they were already up against it on the price for this reason. And when I look at this vehicle, there are some glaring omissions. Like Kia is very keen to say, hey, we've even fitted an electronic brake controller, which, let's face it, is, I don't know, a few dollars worth of electronics mounted to the dash. But you don't get a tow bar, right? The tow bar is an optional extra. And when I looked at their bare rolling chassis thingo display in North Ryde at their head office, it's got these two massive rear recovery points. And I find out that there are actually two tow bar options. These are optional accessories, right? The tow bar is an option. You could get that, or you can get the tow bar with the massive rear recovery points. That doesn't come standard, even though this is X Pro, which is designed with off-road in mind. So there's no recovery point at the rear of this car. And when I look at the specification more broadly, and we just do a quick commercial reality check on that, this vehicle is expensive off the bat. There's no other way of looking at it. But if you wanted to do an apples for apples kind of comparison with some competitors, if you want to put in an electric roller tonneau cover, I had to make a list of all this stuff, it's $5,005 as a genuine accessory, and this is fitted, okay? $5,000. They couldn't even make it $4,990. They had to make it $5,005, go figure. Side steps. Now there's two versions of side steps. There's a premium version and a POVO version. The premium version is $1,631, okay? Most top spec utes come with side steps. If you want a sports bar, and most top spec utes come with sports bars, there's average sort of sports bar, and then there's the compensating for a deficiency in other departments sports bar. So if we go with the compensation sports bar, $1,271 as a genuine accessory. You're not getting that even on X Pro. A snorkel's going to cost you $930 now. Most vehicles do not come standard with snorkels, but the genuine snorkel, almost $1,000. The tow bar kit with the rear recovery points that I just noted, $1,622. If you just want the standard one with no rear recovery points, $1,123. So the way I look at that, they're charging you $500 for 2 bits of plasma cut 16mm steel plate. Go figure. You can also get an aromatherapy diffuser. It's only $50, $53, with refills that are only $17. The official flavours, odours, whatever, osmanthus, whatever that is. Lovely flowers is another flavour, and cologne, non-specific cologne is another one. I want to see Sweet Embrace of Death, the trademark fragrance of Chris Bowen. Anyway, I don't think that's an option. And a bull bar, of course, they will be on offer also. The options are going to be just a bumper bar replacement, so you can still rock the full millhouse and Robbie the robot, or you can disguise things up just ever so slightly with a single hoop job or a 3 hoop job. And I wanted to bring you the price of those as well, but unfortunately Kia's website today says price to be determined, right? So like this X Pro with the metallic paint, I'm seeing that in New South Wales at $78,725 drive away, which is pretty pricey. But if you add those accessories I just listed, including the snorkel, but not the standard tow bar, the expensive one with the red recovery points because they go faster, there's $10,512 of accessories there, and you still need to give it the bull bar and driving light facelift, okay? Still need to do that 10.5 grand later. So drive away, rocking all that gear, but not the bull bar or the driving lights, $89,237 in New South Wales. I'm just going to say that a Hilux Rogue in standard trim is $78,300 drive away, and a Ranger Platinum is $88,385. That's with a 3-litre V6 and tremendously more performance. Kia's got its head in the vice on the price of Tasman. It just has, because they have to pay for all of the R&D up front, which none of the other manufacturers do. But to me, if you can get over Millhouse and Robbie the robot and all of the images that flood into one's head there, the only other big hurdle is the price, and I hope it's not insurmountable for you. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I appreciate it.